Welcome back, Immigrant Nation. Another week, another new episode. If you haven't already become a part of the Immigrant Nation community, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button wherever you're tuning in to this podcast. And you can also join our community by following us on social media. You can find us at An Immigrant's Life. It's also the best way to get in touch if you or someone you know is interested in being a guest on the show. Also, feel free to send an email to animmigrantslife@yahoo.com. Let's connect and share your beautiful story. And that's the biz. Now, let's talk about this week's episode. This week, we have the honor of hosting an accomplished American lawyer, but also the author of the captivating book, Becoming American. In this conversation, our guest shared his extraordinary journey from being a child of Holocaust survivors in post-war Europe to becoming a prominent lawyer and academic. Our conversation spanned crucial topics including the growing antisemitism in America, our guest's perspective on the current generation, and his thought-provoking op-ed piece discussing how immigrants significantly contribute to boosting the economy. I think you're ready for this insightful and thought-provoking episode, so let me cut to the chase. Without further ado, let's get into the show. Isa, dalawa, tatlo. Today's guest is a distinguished writer, retired attorney, and mediator. He's a man full of wisdom, with style and grace. Everyone, please welcome Cary Lowe.
Thank you for having me on. I think our discussion today is extremely timely because the new edition of my book just came out 2 weeks ago. Becoming American is the story of my growing up in post-war Europe with parents who were Holocaust survivors, coming to the United States in my early teens, becoming a U.S. citizen, and then later getting very involved in American politics, business, culture, all stuff I assume we're going to talk about today.
Definitely. But first of all, before we continue, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Of course. And I know you said your book already, but if anyone wants to buy your book or want to get in touch with you, why don't you tell the Immigrant Nation where they can reach you? Or
the book is available now on Amazon or from Barnes & Noble or directly from the publisher, Black Rose. And I also invite people to look at my website, which is called CaryLoweWriter.com for an introductory chapter from the book and lots of information about the contents. And also, if you want to sign up for my mailing list for the future, you can do it there.
Excellent. I'm sure they're going to reach out to you. You don't have Instagram?
No, I don't.
No TikTok? You're not going to be dancing?
No, I'm just on. I'm on Facebook and I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find posts about my writing there, including other things that I've written previously. Most of my writing previously was actually essays that were published in various newspapers, op-ed type essays. I've been writing those for many years. I've published about 80 of those.
Wow.
And there are links to most of those on my website for anybody that's interested. But those essays have to do with politics, with urban planning, which is the field that I worked in for many years, cultural issues, but also a few relating to immigration in particular.
Wow, that's amazing. Were you always been a writer, even when you were young?
I have been a pretty active writer for about the last 40 years. I started out as a high school newspaper editor. That was my
Mm.
introduction to it. I was an avid writer in high school, but I didn't publish much until a few years later, after I had attended law school and was working in politics.
Mm.
I was invited to start writing op-ed essays for the Los Angeles Times,
Mm.
and that grew into a fairly frequent sideline for me during all the years that I was practicing law and teaching and so on.
That's amazing, man. You mentioned high school. Where was this high school?
In the Boston area, in
Mm.
Bedford, Massachusetts.
Okay. You mentioned you're an immigrant. Where did you immigrated from?
I was originally from Austria.
Okay.
My hometown is a small town called Braunau am Inn, which is right on the German border north of Salzburg.
Mm.
And my family, my father was Austrian, from Vienna originally.
Mm.
My mother was from Slovakia, and they, as I say, were both Holocaust survivors.
Mm.
But my father, during the years after the war, after both my parents had immigrated to the U.S., but then went back to Europe,
Mm.
because my father was recruited to work on the staff of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and so when he finished that work, he went to work with U.S. Army Counterintelligence in the post-war occupation, which
Mm.
lasted until the mid-1950s. So my parents moved from Nuremberg in Germany to this small town of Braunau, and I was born while they lived there, and we lived in a number of other places in Europe, but then eventually, through my father's work, we immigrated to the United States in the early 1960s and have lived here ever since.
Mm. Are they still with us, your parents?
No, unfortunately,
Sorry
they're both
to.
deceased.
Okay. Your father was a lawyer as well?
No, he was an engineer by training, but he spoke multiple languages,
Mm.
and being from Eastern Europe and also of Jewish background, he was a good candidate to be a translator and investigator on the Nuremberg military tribunals. So when he concluded that work, those same qualities made him a good candidate to work in the intelligence field, which is what he did then the rest of his career, working for different military-related intelligence agencies.
Wow, that's amazing. How important was your father to you?
Well, I know he always was very proud of that work and thought it was very important. And of course, when I was a child, I didn't really know that much about it, but one of the interesting stories I tell in my book is when we were living in Braunau and he was working with the Counterintelligence Corps there, they would receive people who had been intercepted coming out of Eastern Europe and who were thought to be potentially either agents that could be sent back to Eastern Europe or people who had useful information. And these could be anything from former German military officers to just normal refugees trying to get out of Eastern Europe at that time, but people who knew things that were of interest to the occupation forces in the years after the war. And so often he and his colleagues would meet just to socialize at our home there, because most of them were younger single men, and so they enjoyed the opportunity to come to our home and socialize. And they would talk about their work, and it was fascinating. Even though I was a young child, I picked up on how this was really fascinating and secret stuff I was hearing, which they felt okay sharing in front of me because they didn't figure that a 5-year-old was going to do anything with the information that they heard. And of course, I didn't appreciate it other than to find it fascinating.
Just the stories, I guess, eh?
Great stories, yeah.
Did you ever repeat it to your friends?
Well, that's the funny thing. I would ask my friends from other families that were whose fathers were in similar work if they heard things like, and none of them had any idea what I was talking about. So I had a very unique experience in that
That's
regard.
crazy. How old were you when you moved away from that town?
Well, we first moved to a larger city nearby when I was about 6. And then when the occupation ended in 1955, we moved to Germany, where my father went to work for Air Force intelligence at the U.S. Air Force headquarters in Europe. And then finally, when I was 13, we moved to the United States for the first time. And then I went to high school in the suburb of Boston, and finally became a U.S. citizen when I was 17, which there had been no particular reason to delay that. It just became an issue when I had applied for a scholarship given by the military, and I had to be a U.S. citizen to get that scholarship. And so that forced the issue. And at that point, I became a citizen. My parents and my brother had been citizens for a long time. It just, for some reason, they had never completed the process with me.
They forgot about you.
Somehow, yeah.
That's funny. I was the same thing when I came here in Canada. I knew I was eligible for citizenship, but I was like just keep on pushing and pushing it. No
Uh-huh.
reason, no particular reason, like you said. You worked for you said you enlisted for the U.S. Navy?
Yeah, well, that's where my scholarship came from, was from the Navy. And it required me to participate in Naval ROTC in college and then be commissioned as an officer in the Navy upon graduation. So that's what happened. I served for a while in the Navy after getting out of college, but I got injured and was discharged early and went back to school, to law school at that point. And then that became my primary career. Then
Did you
on.
enjoy the Navy?
No, not particularly. I had lived around the military all through my childhood, and I actually had originally intended to make a career of the Navy. But my personal experiences with the Navy were not as good as I had hoped. And then when I got injured and was told I could be discharged, I accepted that opportunity and then didn't look back. It was fine. I had some great experiences and met some interesting people, but I lost my interest in a career in the military from that limited experience.
Your book, Becoming an American, a political memoir. What made you decide to write a book? I know you told me that you've been writing op-eds. Why a memoir?
Yeah. When my daughter was about 9 years old, I had been thinking for a while about taking a kind of a roots trip back to Europe. And my father had passed away by that time, and I wanted to do that with my mother before she got too old and perhaps died. So we planned this trip, and then sadly, my mother also got very ill and passed away, and so just my daughter and I went. And just before we left, my aunt, my father's sister, who was still alive then, contacted me and asked me to try to find a cemetery outside Prague where her and my father's great grandparents were buried. And so when my daughter and I got over there, that became this search that we took on. And that became eventually the opening chapters of my book. We had quite an adventure tracking down this cemetery, which we had no directions to. All we knew was that it was close to a certain town. And we got very lucky in meeting a couple of people that were able to help us locate it because it was really hidden. You couldn't see it from any road. It was intact. It had not been touched during the war, thankfully. And we got there, it was locked up. I climbed over this tall stone wall to get into it, and succeeded in finding the graves, because I wasn't even sure it was the right cemetery, but it turned out it was. I found the graves. And when I got home from that trip, I wrote a story about it, just really for my family, for my cousins, aunts, and uncles that lived in the United States. And after that, I wrote a couple more stories about my family. And I started to realize these were becoming a continuum, something that I could turn into a book. And that's how it began. So over the next couple of years, while I was still working, I didn't have time to devote myself to this full time, but I gradually pieced together a full-length book. Then, when I moved from Los Angeles to San Diego about almost 20 years ago now, I got involved here with a group of writers that invited me to become part of their group. And they helped me refine my manuscript a great deal, because although I was a pretty decent writer, I had never written a full-length book. And it's different. And these were all people who had published books. And so they were instrumental in helping me refine it. And then I ultimately found a publisher for it. And now, 3 years later, we've just issued an expanded, revised edition of that book.
I love it. What was the hardest part of writing the book?
Oh, trying not to leave out things that were important to the story, at the same time not putting in things that were maybe interesting to me, but not necessarily interesting to readers. And that's a hard thing in writing a memoir, because one likes to think that everything about one's life is interesting. But in fact, an awful lot of what happens in your life might be interesting to your children, other family members, but not really to the general public.
You should tell that to the social media people.
Yeah, the struggle is to identify those things that do make an interesting story for a broader readership, and to tell that story in a way that's almost like a novel. I mean, a memoir is really like a novel because you're telling a story, in this case about yourself, but also about other people. And that's also a tricky issue, how much you want to say about other people. Now, in my case, my parents were no longer alive. Other adults that I wrote about in the book, some were also deceased, and others, the things I wrote about them were largely complimentary. So I didn't feel like I had any concern in that regard. But it can be a big issue for some people writing about their families, especially. They open up the proverbial can of worms and often find that other family members can get very upset over things they disclose that were assumed to be family secrets.
Mm-hmm. Was there anyone that got mad at you?
I didn't feel like I had that problem because none of the things I wrote about reflected badly on anyone or revealed anything that was particularly secret. No, I actually had an enjoyable time uh, writing it, but I had to go back a number of times, and as I thought of additional things and integrate them into the manuscript. And that was one of the reasons why I did the second edition was, if you've been any kind of a writer, you know how you go back and look at something you've written even days later, let alone months or years later, and you think, why did I say it that way? Or why didn't I say more about that? Or that wasn't really that important. Why did I even include that or whatever? And in my case, I became a better writer in the next 3 years. So one thing I did was go back and re-edit the book and just make it a better manuscript. But I also added a few chapters, things that I just hadn't thought about including originally. I'll give you a good example. In the last few years, as part of my professional work, I became very involved with Native American tribes. I did a lot of work with and for tribes in the San Diego region, which is the largest concentration of tribes in the entire United States. And I learned so much and came to understand so much about the relationship of Native Americans to American history and how they were the first Americans. They were here long before anyone else, and that opened my eyes a lot. And I served on the board of a major Native American organization for several years, and that provided me material to add an entire new chapter to the book that I think people will find really interesting, even if they read the first version of the book.
How did you end up working with the Native Americans?
Well, my wife, this is my second wife, who brought me to San Diego. She had a consulting business that had done and continued to do a lot of work with tribes in this region, planning work. And I became involved with her company's work because apart from being a lawyer, I have a PhD in urban planning. So I had done a lot of planning related work and had actually been involved in working not with, but in connection with working in collaboration with a few Native American tribes in other parts of California where I had clients that had land adjacent to or within Indian reservations. So anyway, when I got here, my wife, Trish Butler, got me involved in some of that work that her company was doing. And I wound up writing master plans for one reservation in particular and doing legal work for another tribe that was very extensive in connection with a major development that they were proposing to do outside their reservation. So it had always been interesting to me, the whole culture of Native Americans, but I didn't get nearly as involved with it until I got here and started doing actual work with them.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Going back to your book,
Yes.
it mentioned that you witnessed Jim Crow racism in the South the first time you went to the United States.
Yes.
How did that encounter influence you understanding the American society?
Yeah, it was a real shocking thing to me. I had been living around military bases in Europe, and although the U.S. military had only become fully integrated during those years of my childhood, I was accustomed to living around people of all races and ethnicities. Um, Mostly in those days, the non-white members of the military were African American, but there were some Hispanics, very few Asian, um, but an increasing mix of all ethnicities. So when we came to the United States the first time on a visit when I was 8 years old, and we went to visit relatives who now lived in the South, uh, I was just stunned when I saw the segregation and what they call the Jim Crow uh, laws and practices in effect in those days. This was in the mid 1950s, and uh, I just had not experienced or seen anything like that before. And in those days, you literally still had uh, yeah, water fountains and restrooms and restaurants and hotels and then that either were completely segregated or they had signs on them, white only or for colored. Right? I mean, I was stunned. I asked my father about it, and he was sort of apologetic because he had relatives that were living there, and were not promoting that sort of thing, but still, they were part of the culture that imposed that. And he said, "Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's going to change eventually." But and he said, it's not so easy for Jewish people either here in the South. That your relatives here have to also be very careful. They're not discriminated against in the same way that Black people are, but they're also excluded from many social establishments and just have to be careful about not being too visible in their religious practices and so on. And that's kind of stunned me too, because I hadn't encountered anti-Semitism in Europe, not even in my dealings with Germans in the years after the war. Now, maybe those people, the Austrians and Germans in Europe after the war were they knew better at that point than to say things that would have been construed that way. But nonetheless, I hadn't experienced it, and so to hear that I might experience that in the United States, those were hard things to accept because what I learned in school was that the United States was a place where of equal opportunity for all. And clearly, that wasn't quite the case, at least not then.
But if eventually, did you suffer anti-Semitism from someone?
Yeah, thankfully not in any really vicious ways, but as I got older, and maybe I just noticed it more, but as I got older, I started to occasionally hear people say things that that were clearly anti-Semitic comments, and they, I guess, had no idea I was Jewish, so they said them in front of me. And when you're a kid, you don't know how to react to something like that. You just tend to keep your mouth shut and just make a mental note that the person that said that is not someone you want to be friends with. But I had a few experiences like that later on while we were still living in Germany, and I can't say I did in high school, but when I was in college, occasionally I would hear people say things that were offensive that way, But yeah, fortunately, I never was seriously disadvantaged in any way by that. I was probably luckier than a lot of people in that respect.
Luckily, obviously, with what's happening in the Middle East, I mean, in Israel, a lot of people has been saying that anti-Semitism has been growing again. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's just the
Well,
media?
I haven't personally experienced it, but certainly I, from what I read and what I see on television and so on, I mean, there seems to be quite a resurgence of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's been there all along to a great extent. In the last few years, we've seen the nationalist right have a tremendous growth in this country and in other countries, and anti-Semitism comes along with that. So I'm not surprised that we're seeing it now, but it pains me more to see or hear it among people uh, that I feel closer to politically in so many other respects. And I respect people's opinions about what's going on in the Middle East, and I don't. But I just ask people to separate their views about Israel from their views about Jews generally. You know, and some people seem to have a hard time doing that.
Yeah, because it's easier to clump all people, right? Like it's easier to, like, oh, he's a Jew, so most likely he's a bad person or
Right.
something like
And,
that, you
and,
know?
and that's the thing that, as I say, disappoints me when I hear things like that from people who I know better, and would not be saying that kind of thing were it not for what's going on there right now.
Yeah.
But as I say, as tragic as my family's history was in Europe, I feel very fortunate not to have had to endure anything like that myself.
Yeah, for sure. Being a gentleman of a certain age, what is your view of this generation of Americans? Do you think they're getting smarter and kinder, or do you think it's just sliding down to the abyss?
You know, that's an interesting question because you hear such different stories from people who are involved with younger people in different ways. Um, if you, For many years, I taught at the college level part time. And so I had a lot of exposure to younger people, mostly graduate students, sometimes upper division undergraduates. And my sense is that um, they are as smart or smarter than their predecessors, but they are not as aware culturally and politically and historically. They get their information and their news from a much more limited range of sources, and as a result, they have very narrow perspectives on a lot of things. Uh, Not necessarily bad or offensive, just narrow, and uh, and they don't read nearly as much as prior generations. They prefer to get their information, especially their news, online, and uh, they just won't read anything that they can't digest in a couple of minutes. I mean, I found this very frustrating as a college professor because it was terribly difficult to get them to read uh, any significant amount, even things that they really had to understand for the purposes of courses they were taking. And other professors that I talked to all had the same experience. Um, and again, it's not that they were unintelligent or even uneducated in a narrower sort of sense, but that just didn't seem as engaged with the world around them, other than the cultural aspects that they chose to engage with, which I just think were much narrower than what my generation or even the ones in between would have been doing.
But is it their fault or is it the culture's fault? You know what I mean?
No, I don't see it as the younger people's fault. They've grown up in a culture that that offers them these relatively easy sound bites of information and culture, and unfortunately, what that provides them with uh, is not very detailed or in depth. And so they only get a very superficial amount of information about any given topic. And you have to remember, too, that that information they are getting has been curated by somebody who may have an agenda of their own. So whether it's Facebook, TikTok, or whatever, somebody is putting that information out there and is making choices about what information to present and what not. And so if you're a teenager today looking for information, well, unless you want to take the initiative to read a major newspaper or and listen to the evening national news on a network station, and even that has become narrower and narrower. But unless you really make an effort, you're just not going to get the kind of breadth of information that we were accustomed to getting. Um, I see this even in my kids, who are, I think, more engaged than most, but yet they too, they're busy. They get most of their information from these same kinds of online sources. But I try to encourage them to go beyond that, and to an extent they do.
Yeah. They're going to say, like, Dad, you're too old. No one reads the newspaper anymore.
No, when I was teaching college, I used to ask my students what their information sources were. And one of the things I asked was, how many of you read a daily newspaper? Virtually zero. Really. And it didn't matter if they were college seniors, graduate students. They had just stopped reading newspapers. It was not quite as bad, say, 20 years ago, but 10 years ago when I resumed teaching after a 10-year break. That's when I was really astonished when they told me that virtually none of them ever looked at a newspaper, and half of them said they never even looked at news online. If something just fell in their lap, they might read it, or if they were looking at an interesting video and it gave them some information, sure, that was fine, but they didn't go in search of it.
Yeah, that's how it is. There's so much information out there that you don't even know what to focus on.
Well, that's right. It's like a fire hose of information coming at you all the time. And if you're not already pretty educated, it's hard to sift through it and figure out what's important and what you should concentrate on.
That's right. That's right. I saw one of your articles, I believe, that you wrote, Immigrants Boost the Economy.
Mm-hmm.
I love that line. Would you like to elaborate that?
Sure. No, especially these days when there's so much antagonism toward immigrants by people who think that immigrants just come here to get free benefits and and take from us, from the American economy, instead of contributing to it. And nothing could be further from the truth. Maybe when people first arrive here for a brief period of time, they might need assistance in getting settled and getting initially integrated. But it's like it always has been. People start by joining a community of others like them that came before them. They get jobs, they start businesses. There's the classic immigrant businesses of opening restaurants or small shops and things, or they just get other kinds of jobs, especially if they're relatively fluent in English. There's all kinds of job opportunities available to them. But more importantly, what we see is, and what we've always seen is, that within one generation, their children are full-fledged Americans. Their children grow up speaking English, going to English-speaking schools, playing with English-speaking children, and becoming Americanized very rapidly. Now, they may act as a bridge for their parents or grandparents initially, and that's very common. But the family as a whole is going to become, in most cases, very integrated into American culture and the economy, and even politics. And it just you just have to look around and you see how true that is. And if you do even the smallest amount of reading and research on it, there are studies constantly supporting that, documenting that. The other thing that people misunderstand is, and this is a line that's been fed to them again by a lot of white nationalists, that immigrants tend to be criminals, that they are smuggling drugs, that they're committing crimes here at a high rate. Fact is that immigrants commit crime at a far lower rate than native-born Americans do. And it's not surprising. They're trying to get integrated in and be accepted. So sure, in any population, there's going to be some number of people doing bad things, but the vast majority, no. They're trying as hard as they can to get to become part of mainstream American culture. And the last thing that you would expect them to do is engage in criminal conduct. And the statistics bear that out. So no, I think people really need to look at that and understand that immigrants are great contributors to the American economy and to American culture in the broadest sense. You look at at our culture going back a couple of generations, and it's remarkable how much of our culture, whether it was music, film, literature, how much of that was created by immigrants, especially European immigrants, but not exclusively, immigrants from many parts of the world. And when you show people, like, who were the people that started the movie studios? Who were the people that wrote some of the most famous songs that are classic American pieces of music? So many of these things were the product of not just immigrants, but in some cases very recent immigrants. So it's something people's eyes and ears really should be opened up to more, because it's the information's there.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think most Americans are so against immigrants or immigration?
Well, I don't think most Americans are, honestly, but I think that immigrants make an easy target for people who are looking for a target, looking for someone to scapegoat. And so there's a long history in this country of targeting recent immigrants and blaming them for all kinds of social ills and economic ills. If the economy is in a slump, what could be easier than to say, well, that's because of those newcomers who have stolen so many of the jobs, right? And if you're a working class guy who's out of a job or is jealous of people who maybe are doing better than you are economically, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that kind of propaganda and then being drawn to these white nationalist causes that propagate that kind of information. But it's not just in the United States. I mean, you see the same thing going on in much of Europe right now, in just wherever there are large numbers of immigrants coming in. It's the easiest thing to blame those people for a depressed economy or a shortage of jobs or anything that you might not like in the direction the culture is going. So, but I really do believe that most Americans don't take that attitude. That thankfully it's unfortunately growing, but still relatively marginal population doing that.
For sure. Your book, what message or insight do you hope readers take away from your personal journey and experiences?
Oh, I think the main insight I hope they take away is exactly what we've just been talking about, how immigrants are contributors to American society. I near the end of the book, I talk about looking back on my career and as a lawyer and being involved in real estate and having, in one way or another, contributed professionally to building something like 25,000 homes.
Wow.
Which is twice as many as in my hometown in Austria or the town where I went to high school in Massachusetts. In some cases, helping develop whole new communities. I've taught hundreds and hundreds of college students. I've written and participated in political campaigns, and I'd like to think made California and the country a better place in many respects. So I want people to read my story, not because I want them to cheer for me or tell me I've done something great, but to use my story as to see how much immigrants can and do contribute to this country, whether it's economically, politically, culturally, in every respect. That's the lesson that I want people to come away with. And to the extent that they do that, then I feel like I've accomplished something.
Beautiful. Well said. Well said. I think we're there. But before we close out, I want to close this with one question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Can you share your perspective on what it means to be an American?
Yes. I think to be an American, hopefully, ideally, is to be committed to the kinds of ideals that are in the founding documents of this country. We have always lived up to them, unfortunately. And in some respects, they were narrower than they should have been. Women didn't get the vote until early in the 20th century. We had a lot of racial injustice, even well into the middle of the 20th century, and of course some of it continues today. So I don't idealize America, but I think that to be an American in the best sense is to at least believe in those principles and to try to live your life in a way that upholds those principles. And I think most people agree with that. It makes me sad that there's a significant and seemingly growing portion of our population that doesn't seem to respect those views. But for most people, I think those still are the views they hold, and that's definitely my perspective. So that to me is really what it means to be an American.
Well said, sir. I think we're there. Again, it's been such a pleasure to have a conversation with you, Mr. Cary. Before we close out, do you want to say your website again, where they can reach you and your book?
Yes, thank you. The book is called Becoming American. It's just been released in a new second edition, available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and from Black Rose, the publisher, or through my website, which is carylowewriter.com. And I hope that if you purchase it and read it, that you'll find it an interesting and compelling story, and we'll tell other people about it as well.
Definitely. Again, Mr. Cary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good evening.
Good evening to you too.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Again, Cary, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really do appreciate it. Thank you, listeners, for listening. This is Aaron Deliosa for An Immigrant's Life. I'll see you guys later.